after a story, I suppose. Well, I've got one for you, actually, and it's all about rhymes and lyrics and riddles and incredible premonitions and all sorts, and it's called Thomas the Rhymer, so very, very fitting for this rhyme-filled folklore Thursday. It's from Scotland. It's been a while since we did a story from Scotland, and there are quite a few famous seers and truth-tellers in Scotland, and quite a few young lads who got taken away to fairy lands. I came across a story just the other day which got me quite excited until I realised it was basically this one. So I'm going to stick with Thomas the Rhymer. He was once known as a very clever predictor of things that would come to be. Now, we've all heard of Nostradamus. Nostradamus is a famed name the whole world over. He was this French guy who claimed to have predicted the end of the world among many other events. But Nostradamus was not, by a long chalk, the only medieval fellow who boasted of seeing the future. And in Scotland, the most famous prophet of them all, which is why we're telling his story, was actually historically called Thomas the Rhymer. Thomas the Arielkinson. I'm not sure about the pronunciation, but Thomas the Rhymer is how we came to know him. Some people insist to this day that Thomas was a shrewder sage than Merlin himself. In his time, True Thomas, as Sam called him, was said to have predicted the outcome of all sorts of battles, you know, and William the Wallace, Braveheart and all that stuff, Robert the Bruce and the Spider. Both of those were fighting the English back during the times of Thomas the Rhymer. But he also foretold the arrival of King James to unite the island of Britain many centuries later, and all sorts of things that haven't even happened yet. I mean, I don't know if he mentioned aliens, but he might have done. We just never heard him properly. But it's very hard to be sure, really, because a bit like Nostradamus himself, Thomas only made his predictions in mysterious rhymes, which could really mean anything. Like, the kestrel dances with the worm, and thus do all the planets turn. Now, this could, for instance, predict the establishment of the first International Space Station or a skirmish in Glasgow in 1363. It's very difficult, you know, it's very much up to how you decode the rhymes. And in the olden days, they decode any old nonsense. But at least the extraordinary way in which Thomas the Rhymer gained his powers of prediction were very clearly related on many occasions by the man himself. When he was still a lad of around 18 years old, Thomas liked to live his life idling under an old hawthorn tree on the banks of the Huntly Burn, a stretch of water trickling off the River Tweed near his home in Earlston. There, Thomas would strum his lute, making up silly songs and dreaming of being rich. And one warm afternoon in May, Thomas was doing just this when a figure rode by, intrigued by his singing. Why does it always rain on me? And so on. He was just working his way through the Scottish songbook. But she was intrigued by his singing, and Thomas gasped and goggled and gaped. If you're gasping, goggling and gaping at the same time, you're looking at something worth looking at. And this rider was, without question, the most desirable person he had ever laid eyes on. Just some people just seem to glow with a certain kind of beauty, and this tall, elegant lady, clad all in green velvet, a bit like me here, red hair cascading down to her knees, she seemed to shine with a glamorous gorgeousness. She was perched on a grey dappled mare with 59 jingling bells threaded on its mane, and Thomas didn't need to look into this woman's eyes to know that they were green. I mean, that kind of fantastically beautiful woman with red hair always has green eyes. Thomas was never a shy laddie, and when the lady drew near, he arose and bowed. "My dearest lady, I am Thomas the Rhymer and can only speak the truth. You must surely be the Queen of Heaven. No other place could provide such a flaming torch of beauty." The Queen gave a small giggle, but did not blush. "Thomas the Rhymer, Your truth is wonky, she replied, for I am the Queen of Elfland, which is a much more jolly place. Ach, I wish I was not cursed to always speak the truth, your highness, because then I could deny that the only thing I wish to do before I die is to kiss your lips. There was still no blushing from the elf queen. She dismounted from her horse. Well, I shall not lie either, Thomas. Anyone who kisses me has to remain in my thrall for 7 years. It looks like a very nice thrall to me, your highness, replied Thomas. 7 years would be cheap. Come here under my hawthorn tree and let me serenade you. And kiss me do. Anyway, the Queen pressed her powerful lips on Thomas's own and folded him in a fond embrace. And then she rode on her horse, and Thomas just trotted along behind her with a great big smile on his face, which stretched right up to his eyebrows. I'm not sure I can do it for you. Something like that. That was basically Thomas at this stage. Anyway, soon they arrived at the Great Eildon Hill, a place that you can go to this day, a real place in the borders of Scotland. Folk to this day insist that the hill is completely hollow. There was a horn hung on the horse's saddle, which the elf queen lifted to her lips and played a short but pretty tune, prettier than that one. At this sound, the side of the hill just opened up like a gigantic flower, and Thomas could see through the entrance a road which split off in 3 directions. The first road is paved with thorns and nettles, and they say it leads to paradise, the elf queen said. The last road is festooned with roses and lilies, and may well lead to the darkest pits of hell. The middle road leads to my home. Which shall it be, Thomas the Rhymer? The lad needed no thinking time. I'm always happy to take the middle road, your majesty, he grinned, and so their journey continued into the hill, down a green and winding path for many miles. Deep underground they travelled, and to Thomas's surprise, they then had to wade through a river of blood. The Queen explained that all the blood shed on earth trickled down into the middle earth and ran in rivers. Fortunately, they were then bathed clean by a splashing, silvery waterfall, and eventually they arrived in another green and pleasant pasture, with the Queen's silver castle just in sight on the horizon. Trees loaded with the juiciest, ruddiest apples and pears filled the pasture. Thomas was weak with hunger, but as he lifted his hand to the fruit, the Queen of Elfland stopped him. Not yet, Thomas, she warned. You are not yet ready for the knowledge this fruit brings. Luckily, she had brought some sandwiches with her, so they shared those and were soon on their way down to the Elfland castle, Thomas happily plucking on his lute as they journeyed. All was pleasure and playtime at the castle when they arrived, with pink wine just flowing like a fountain through the central courtyard, and bountiful buffets of rich berries and fantastic toast, all being enjoyed by a glorious army of golden nymphs, elves, fauns and knights, you know, the kind that you see in magical fairyland castle, all of them just laughing and dancing to the sound of the sweetest fairy band. Again, it was so much nicer than this, but what can I tell you? Thomas was welcomed into this party with open limbs, and in such a place it's hardly surprising that 7 years felt like one longish, pleasant weekend to the young laddie. Soon, though, it became time for Thomas to return. The Queen of Elfland walked Thomas back to the fruit trees and twisted off a particularly ripe and ruddy, luscious pear. Before you eat and before you go, she said, which shall you choose? To be the greatest lute player in the world, or the greatest prophet? There can be no going back once the selection is made. Thomas to be honest, already considered himself rather gifted with the lute. You know, he couldn't really get any better. So there was no doubt in his mind as he took the biggest, sweetest bite out of the fruit and chewed it with mouth-watering delight. The delicious taste was only crowned by the delivery of one final big lip-smacking kiss from the Queen of Elfland. Thomas only dared glance back once as he set off, but all he saw beneath the tree when he looked back was a white hart chewing on a pear. The return journey to the old hawthorn tree where he'd been playing his lute all those years ago seemed a lot quicker than the journey outwards had been, and soon Thomas was back with his astonished family and friends, who had to presume that the poor poet had been swept away by the river and was a goner. He only told his very nearest and dearest what had actually happened to him, but most folk guessed due to his new and wondrous ability to see into men and women's minds and foretell not just their future, but the whole future of the Scottish, the British, and indeed all the people of the world, perhaps until the very crack of doom. This was always depending, of course, on how you interpreted his curious rhymes. You know, he'd get this funny look in his face and say something like, "Ach, the ladybirds will fly in through the back entrance when the eagle comes down to have his tea," something like that. And then they'd have to go, is he talking about Culloden? Because that's not happened yet, and so on. And they'd work it out eventually. Anyway, nonetheless, despite his gnomic problems, Thomas the Rhymer's poetic powers made true Thomas rich and fat as he grew old, and he built himself a tower atop a hill where he would feast with friends and regale them with poems and performances, and they loved every minute. I wish I had some friends like that. But that tower is really there as well. Anyway, he lived a long life telling his tales and enjoying his feasts, until one day, when his hair was as festooned with silver as his treasury, a friend of Thomas's arrived at one of his parties and reported that a handsome white hart had been seen in the village nearby, seemingly seeking something. "Ah, that is the sign for me," Thomas stood and announced with a big smile that once again stretched right up to his eyebrows. "Enjoy the rest of the feast, everybody, and mind how you go." And from that time forth, nobody saw Thomas the Rhymer ever again, although many say he's somewhere beneath that hollow hill in Ercleston, strumming his lute and preparing for his comeback tour. But how can we know? Because he's not around to tell us what's going to happen. Is that the end? I'll say it's the end for now. I think you've had quite enough. But yes, please do go up and find Earlston in Berwickshire. That's where you'll find the tower, that's where you'll find the hill. And just listen out for some very special lute playing. Look after yourself.